Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Schiller. Rabbi Schiller is a noted and acclaimed author, educator, and speaker. Rabbi Schiller was formerly the Talmud Instructor at Yeshiva University High School for boys and has lectured and written extensively on a wide range of contemporary Jewish issues. Rabbi Schiller has contributed to many prominent periodicals, including journals in England, South Africa, and has lectured on religion, culture, politics, race, and ethnicity. Rabbi Schiller is the author of two books, The Road Back, A Discovery of Judaism Without Embellishments, and The Guilty Conscience of a Conservative. Rabbi Schiller is also the author of a monograph in defense of Rav Samson and Raphael Hirsch's Torah in Derech Eretz philosophy, titled, "And They Shall Judge the People with True Righteousness." And today we will be discussing the fascinating historical internal disputes in Jewish history, and we're going to try to cover a lot of ground, from Maimonides to the Hasidic movement, to Zionism and anti-Zionism, secular studies, the role of women. We'll see how much we can cover today. Rabbi Schiller, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay. So let's start with the Rambam, Maimonides. Why was there opposition to the Rambam, Maimonides' writings? And what were the key issues in the debate? Was it rationalism, philosophy versus another approach? Why the opposition, and where are we today in that internal dispute?
The Rambam was such a unique individual in that he encompassed so much in his person and in his writings. It was almost inevitable that there was going to be opposition developing to him, ranging from his audacious, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, his audacious statement in the Hakdamah to the Mishnah Torah, where he says, people will no longer need to learn Talmud. We will learn Chumash and his Mishnah Torah, and that will be sufficient. And right away there, the Ravid launches a stringent criticism of the Rambam. So that's just one area. I think primarily what happened was that the Rambam was in Spain originally. He goes eventually to Morocco and Eretz Israel and winds up in Egypt. But the Rambam originally is from Spain, where Judaism was encountering philosophical versions of Christianity and moreover of Islam. And therefore he felt it was very important to respond to those religions in their new Greek-influenced sense of their own philosophies. And so he wrote the monograph, and so we find in his Yesodei HaTorah an extensive discussion of what we would see today as an Aristotelian metaphysics. Physics and metaphysics were not so far removed in the Rambam's day. So what happened was, when this approach becomes known after the translation of the monograph into Lashon Kodesh, this becomes known in France, primarily in South France. So there is a tremendous opposition, which is engaged by Rabbeinu Yonah, by Rabbi Shalom of Montpellier, and by others who saw this as a deviation from normative Judaism, the acceptance of Greek philosophical notions, the desire to express Judaism in those terms. So that fire burns for a while. There are those who say that in later time, when the Gemara was actually burnt in a public ritual in France, that this opposition becomes dissipated. But I think what really happens is that Klal Yisrael focuses on the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah, the Perush HaMishnayos, the Sefer HaMitzvahs, and sort of ignores the Rambam of the Monograph and the implications which that Sefer might have. So the Machlokes quiets down, but by ignoring the reality of the Rambam in some of his incarnations. Um, was it about philosophy versus anti-philosophy? It's hard to say. I think today we would be hard pressed to describe the Aristotelian metaphysics of the Rambam as philosophy in the modern sense of the term. So it's hard to call it philosophy versus anti-philosophy. There is an area, though, of the Rambam's thinking, which is, I would say, rationalist as opposed to mystical or traditional, and that is in the reasons for mitzvos, the identity of Klal Yisrael, the identity of holy places or of holiness in general. And there the Rambam sounds a decidedly different note from that which we are accustomed to today. Many of your viewers might know this from the Ramban's critique of the Rambam's understanding of Kabbanos in Sefer Vayikra, the beginning of Sefer Vayikra. And the Rambam tries to fit mitzvahs into this worldly benefits, into things which will help the individual arrive at true beliefs. It will help society formulate itself in a just way. It will educate people towards appropriate midos. Whereas according to the Ramban, and I think what has become the main body of Klal Yisrael, there is some dissent today on this, growing dissent on this today, but the main body of Klal Yisrael that saw mitzvahs also as capable of an essentialist uh, improvement of the substructure of the soul and of the cosmos in general. So that Karbanos are not teaching us good things. I mean, they might be teaching us good things, but primarily they're altering in reality, in a mystical reality, they're altering the very essence of being. And that distinction between the Rambam and others also brought great criticism down upon him. But once again, history has kind of moved beyond that, with the exception of today, where one finds some attempt on what, again, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but the modern Orthodox academic left. Again, no one should be offended by that. I don't mean to criticize them, but they have resurrected the rationalist critique of the Rambam.
So would you say that that's the only area where that dispute still in some way exists, or is that we're just we don't even think that way anymore? We don't think philosophy, we don't think Aristotle. That's just not modern man anymore. Is that the case, or is there still some kind of a dispute that exists?
No, I think the only dispute which lingers is amongst that element of modern Orthodox academics or philosophers who would like to uh, de-burden Orthodox Jewry from the heavy overlay of mysticism, which has become accepted in all segments of Orthodoxy, Hasidim, Misnagdim, religious Zionists. Rav Kook was a great believer in Kabbalah. So I think that this attempt is to move us away from that. And also, if I might add another point, I think that the Rambam, and here you'd have to go to Menachem Kellner and Mark Shapiro and their writings, but the Rambam does not see essentialist distinctions between Jew and non-Jew. And that certainly runs counter to what is accepted belief in, let's say, 90% of Klal Yisrael today. So that does linger. So bits and pieces linger here and there.
Okay. Um, Moving on much further in Jewish history, the Hasidic movement. Why was the mainstream Orthodox leadership so hostile to the emerging Hasidic movement? And how did that movement defend itself? What was the dispute?
I think there are two essential areas of dispute. One is the Misnagdic world, if we can call them that, the Misnagdic world's rejection of what they sensed or fear of what they sensed to be antinomian strains within the Hasidic movement, a rejection of normative halacha in the name of playing with normative halacha due to certain mystical assumptions and speculations. That was one. Two was what they saw as a downplaying of the centrality of Limud Torah, and three would be what they saw as an excessive emphasis upon the righteous man as a mediatrix between God and the Jewish people. And this led to an extensive amount of charamim issued in the Batei Dinim of Lita, one of which was certainly signed by the Vilna Gaon, another might have been signed by him, but dozens and dozens of such charamim were issued against the Hasidic movement due to these three factors, essentially. Or the Hasidic defense, yes, I'm sorry. The Hasidic defense against this was found in many Sfarim. I think with the antinomian stuff, the Hasidic movement created over time a new nomianism, so that there's a humorous story I can tell you that the
And again, by nomianism, we mean?
the norms of Judaism.
Right, okay.
So the Visions of Beis Medrash in London once wanted to daven Shabbos, Yontif, before the Sov Zman Tefillah, and they were told in no uncertain terms by the Visions Rebbe of Monsey, Ramatullah, that they were not to do so because it would be an abandonment of their normal tradition. So that, in a sense, the antinomianism became a new tradition which replaced to some extent the old one, and there it froze and there it stabilized. In other words, I don't think there are any new such tendencies in the Hasidic movement. They were accepted, and history went on as if they were part of some pre-existing halachic norm. So I think that's one thing that happened, that the changes froze in history. Secondly, many Sfarim were written which attempted to disagree with the basic text of Hisnagdus, which is the Nefesh HaChaim, the Yesod Avodah of Slonim, and many other such works, which attempted to accentuate the importance of the emotive kiyuvim of Judaism, fear of God, love of God, devekus, attachment to God, and a different approach to Torah Lishma as opposed to that of the Nefesh HaChaim, who says Torah Lishma means for the sake of knowing Torah. And they would, of course, include other things, such as for the sake of God, for the sake of one's neshama. So there is a literature that grows up to refute the Misnagdish Shetainas. What happens in history is that in the 1830s, 1840s, the effect of the Haskalah moving east becomes a threat to all segments of Torah Jewry. And therefore, by the time we get to that period, the Hasidim and Misnagdim, even in Lita, are uniting in order to wage war against the Haskalah before the Russian government, and Rebbe Itzel of Volozhina, together with Tzemach Tzedek, went together to the Russian government. So I think as time went on, these differences began to decrease. I would add, and again, there are two different analyses available here. The Misnagdim would say that their Hisnagdus tempered the excesses, the radical excesses of the Hasidim. And the Hasidim would say the Misnagdim saw the truth that there were no actual excesses. So we'd have to analyze those two different understandings. But today I think that almost anywhere in the world, these distinctions are overlooked in the name of an overriding Hasidism, and both groups help each other in this regard. There was a lingering element of this some years back, and Rav Shach's criticism of Chabad and Chabad's response. But if there was such a battle, it was waged only in those environs, and that too has pretty much faded from the scene.
Was part of the reconciliation, in addition to external forces such as the Haskalah, that you begin to see works like the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Baal HaTanya is writing halachic legal Jewish works and not just Hasidic philosophical Kabbalic works. Was that part of it as well? Would you say that was like the reaction of the Hasidic world to kind of temper the opposition from the other side?
And we can well add the Tzemach Tzedek, who wrote voluminously on Shilas and Shuvas and Gemara, and of course from Ger we have Chedush Yorim and Sfas Emes, and today there's hundreds of Hasidic authors writing on all manner of Gemara and Shulchan Aruch areas. Did that build up the Hasidic credibility in Misnagdish eyes? I don't know. I never thought about that possibility. I think there were some figures in history, and this is a different point, such as Reb Shraga Feivel Mendelowitz and such as Rav Hutner and Chaim Berlin, who sought to create an amalgamation of Hasidus and Hisnagdus. And that model, I think, has been adopted by a lot of people who can equally learn the Svarim of both these camps and sort of fuse them, as did, say, Beis Medrash Elyon or Chaim Berlin, fuse these movements together. So I think that also had an effect on weakening the old school Hisnagdus.
Again, moving on in history, 20th century, rise of nationalism, the rise of Zionism. Why did so many 20th century Orthodox leaders vehemently oppose Zionism? What was the argument within the Orthodox camps? In other words, how did the religious Zionists respond to all those arguments?
Actually, and I have researched this somewhat extensively, anti-Zionism, by which I mean an idealistic opposition to the establishment of Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael pre-Mashiach, is not heard so much in the what we might call anti-Zionist circles at the end of the 19th and early part of the 20th century. It's primarily a fear of the lack of religiosity and a lessening of religious loyalties in Zionist circles. And one is hard pressed. I mean, there are those, the Minkat Sharov and Grada the Rashab of Lubavitch, who do speak in terms of it is illegitimate to have a state pre-Mashiach, but it's not as extensive as you might think. It's primarily this movement represents a threat to the practice of Torah mitzvahs. And in fact, in the Agudas Yisrael world movement, there were many who were quite willing to go along with the establishment of a state. It was a Mi'at who had ideological anti-Zionism. But what you did have was ideological, and this is going to seem like an ironic title, you had ideological non-Zionism, which I think is the overwhelming majority of what we call Haredim today, are non-Zionists. That is to say, they have taken no position on whether it is inherently bad or inherently good to have Jewish sovereignty over Eretz Yisrael pre-Mashiach. They say, this is the reality, let's make the best of it. And in some of their, again, poor term, in some of their more left-wing circles, there is actual happiness, overt happiness, at the fact that we have Eretz Yisrael today. So I think the staunch anti-Zionists are few in number. Obviously, Satmarov was very influential in those circles. The Tol Zahara movement, Tushensky, large parts of Misnagdish, Yishuv HaYashin, and Meir Sharim were antagonistic to the very idea. But for most, it's a non-Zionist stance, which leads to a lot of complexities and problems because the anti-Zionists never took money from the Israeli government. They never voted in the elections. whereas the non-Zionists do both those things, thus calling into question somewhat exactly what their stance is. But they have placed their flag in decidedly non-Zionist circles. So again, to repeat, the original opposition largely due to fear of not being orthodox and to a small extent ideological as well.
How serious was that dispute in terms of uh, would you say that the overwhelming number of Orthodox Jews in leadership were non-Zionists, or no? Sometimes you hear, this Rav, that Rav, and you get the impression that it wasn't so. It wasn't 99 to 1. The numbers were a little bit different at the time.
Right. Well, it certainly wasn't 99 to 1 because you had the Mizrahi movement, which was a movement of religious Zionists, which in the early stages of Zionist international movements created its own niche. Rav Reines was the founder of that. So there are Gedolim here and there who are overtly pro-Zionist, and that they create what is today the religious Zionist movement in Eretz Yisrael, which is a growing movement with many yeshivas and many Gedolim who think that it was a great blessing that we got Eretz Yisrael. Now, again, you have on the nether reaches in some segments of non-Zionism. For example, Reb Shraga Feivel Mendelovich himself was very happy about the creation of the State of Israel. The story is that he actually left the radio on in the time of the UN partition vote. He lived at that point in Muncie, and he was very happy. He told his Talmidim if he was younger, he would get a gun and go to Eretz Yisrael to join the Haganah, to join the Israeli army. So I think that you did have in some areas of the non-Zionists. Plus, I would add, and this might be editorializing on my part, plus, if you read the Hamadiyya and the Ated and the Ami and the non-Zionist journals, there is a great sense of pride and identification with the Israeli military successes, with army efforts. There's a sense of sadness over losses. So that is a strange recent amalgamation. Well, not so recent. I think that since the state was founded, you've had this sense of identification among non-Zionists with the state, while simultaneously proclaiming that they are not Zionists, and the word Zionist in their vocabulary is a bad one. But I always say if I read the Aten Hamidah every week, it looks like the yearbook of the IDF with so many pictures and descriptions. So there is this, I don't want to call it confused because if I may go a step further here, I think that the attempt in the non-Zionist world to say that they don't go to the army because their Torah is protecting Eretz Yisrael and that the army is really doing nothing, it's them and their yeshivas. Although one might ask, how come the Torah of Hesed yeshivas doesn't do this? But that's a side kasha. But in any event, they say that their Torah is protecting. I don't think that's their real reason for not going. I think the real reason for not going is a very simple one. They have built successful, sociologically sound communities with happiness and sadness and families and simchas and yeshivas, and they've built a very successful, content, insular world. And they feel that if they would allow their young people to step outside that world into an alternative Orthodox model, which they would encounter in the army, that the loyalty and consolations of their world might be called into question. I think that's the real reason.
Um, when you say, Rabbi Schiller, that non-Zionists who are happy with the state of Israel, in other words, happy that there is a state of Israel, is that the same as saying that they look at history and say, in 1948, Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, Paskind, he gave a decision that there should be a state of Israel, and therefore the state of Israel is a positive and good thing for the Jewish people.
Implicitly, not explicitly. Professor Benjamin Brown, who's a professor in Eretz Yisrael from the religious Zionist camp, essentially, he uses the phrase, Haredim are right-wing religious Zionists in their kishkas. So that I think that's the truth. I think there's an implicit and an explicit part of their world. Implicitly, I agree with you. They are happy. They are happy. Post 67, they were part of the same euphoria that everybody was, well, except for the anti-Zionists. And however, explicitly, they will deny that they are part of Israel. And of course, overt ritual celebrations of the state are unheard of in their society. There's no Hallel, but alternatively, there's none of the Satmar Tzurikata laning of Vayichal. So they've located themselves away from the essential issue at stake here. And I think that you're right that implicitly they're happy at it.
We have these concepts, Torah Umada, which comes out of Yeshiva University. We have Torah in Derech Eretz, which was an approach based on Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. How does this play in Jewish history? How do you fit them in? Do people dispute these strains as a misunderstanding of, in other words, anytime you have Torah and something else, there's always criticism. Torah Umada, Torah Derech Eretz, Torah Vavoda, B'nai Akiva, for example. Why isn't it enough to have Torah, right? The Torah. What disputes arose, and how do you view this in the historical perspective?
Throughout Jewish history, depending upon the society in which Jews lived, there was greater or lesser assent to general knowledge. Spanish Jewry, as we discussed before, in the Golden Age of Spain, Renaissance Italy is another example of that. Central European, Western European, and American Orthodoxy before the arrival of the Hasidim and of the staunch Misnagdim. All those worlds, to greater or lesser degrees, participated in and thought there was value in knowledge. I always say that the key to understanding the Torah, Mada, term, Derech Eretz positions, and I do think at root they are very similar. They diverge socially and culturally, but at root I think they're very similar, is the belief, and this is going to sound that I'm trying to be facetious, but I'm not, the belief that God created the world and all the people in it, that creation is not insignificant, that the universe is God's handiwork and therefore not insignificant. And similarly, the fact that he created 7.5 billion or whatever the number is today, non-Jews, is a strong indication that that is not insignificant in his eyes. So it is deriving from the fact of creation, Bereshit bara Elokim, is deriving a worldview and a philosophy. So I think that's the essence both of Torah Mada and of Torah Derech Eretz, that creation is of significance. Now, the reaction to that and the opposition to that, which was very fierce in many times in Jewish history, is based upon the notion that whatever significance these things might have, they pale by comparison with the explicit Kedusha of Torah mitzvahs. And therefore, we have neither the time nor the energy to pursue both. We are far better served by learning a long Tosfos or by performing an act of internal chesed than we would be by pursuing nature or humanity. So that's the two sides of the coin. Would the anti-Torah Mada, Torah Derech Eretz camp say that these things have no significance? I don't think they could argue that, but they would say they have far, far less significance. And I think both camps can produce rayas from Chazal and rayas from Rishonim on this. What happened was, I fear, is that the American yeshiva world which was de facto Torah Derech Eretz, because they all had high schools and many of them went to college, that when they encountered the staunch yeshivism of Rabban Kotler and Lakewood and of the Hasidim, they were at a loss to articulate their own position, so that yeshivism sort of slipped into yeshivism. And for example, Breuer's itself in Washington Heights sort of moved over the decades to a more yeshivish perspective. And I would offer that's because they failed to articulate in coherent, consistent terms what their alternative worldview was. The Yeshiva Spring Valley took their student body to Mets games every year until at some point they stopped saying it was inappropriate. And again, that's because the right-wing Orthodox world said to them implicitly, what are you doing? Explain your position. What are you doing here? And they didn't have enough of a Hirschian or a cooking and grounding to be able to offer an alternative. Now, having said that, I'm far from convinced that the non-Orthodox world in reality, not in theory, in reality, is that much clearer. Rabbi Lamb, in his book Torah Mada, offers a prayer to be said before engaging in the study of chemistry. It's sort of a l'shem yichud, well, not l'shem yichud is not Hasidic, but hareini muchen u'mezuman, to be mekayim the mitzvah of studying Gadlus Haborei and Hashemayim of Saprin Kavod Kael, and listing a few psukim and what the inyan is to increase Yiras Hashem and Havas Hashem. And I always thought that if the modern Orthodox world was really serious about what they say they're serious about, there would be a whole likutei tfilos, to use the Breslova term. There would be a whole likutei tfilos of such prayers to be uttered when engaging with knowledge and beauty and human experience. So I suspect to some degree, Torah Madaism is an ex post facto rationalization, which is not to say that it's not true. I have defended it in print and in public, but I think for most people, it functions as an ex post facto rationalization for living in closer proximity to contemporary culture. Now, as far as Term Derech Eretz is concerned, again, that's a team which has pretty much left the playing field. Breuer's, when confronted with the map of modern Orthodoxy versus Yeshivishism, they opted for Yeshivishism, much as I had a friend of mine, Hungarian Ashkenaz Orthodox Jew, also a movement which has faded from the scene, the old Ashkenaz Yotzeris reciting Hungarian Ashkenaz Orthodox. He once said to me in his deep Hungarian accent, "We are discontinued item. We no more discontinued." So I think in that sense, Breuer's term Derech Eretz is also a discontinued item. So this is sad. In religious Zionist circles in Eretz Yisrael, I think it varies. The Chadal world certainly has no patience for the universalism or the breadth and scope of Rav Kook, although again, he functions as a figurehead to their movement, but not in his real worldview. Perhaps in some parts of religious Zionism, there is more of an openness. Certainly when Rav Lichtenstein or Rav Amital were in Gush Etzion and Har Etzion, there was a greater sense that the totality of existence mattered. We're going to have to wait and see on this. I don't know where it's all going to wind up. I think in the staunch yeshivish and Hasidic parts of America, which I know better than Eretz Yisrael, that many of the parents are not happy with the educational system as it now stands. So who knows? God is the king of history. Who knows where it's going to end up?
20th century feminism spreads in Western societies and democracies. Women get the right to vote, women become more public figures. And now today, if you look around, at least I know in my community, there's probably more classes insured for women than there are for men. I mean, women get all the classes, they get all the great speakers, men, women, Rabbanim, everything. How has
In
this...
many inyanim,
Yeah.
far more broad a map of inyanim which are taught.
Absolutely, absolutely. How is that debate? How did it play out in Orthodox circles? How is it being played out today?
This is such an important subject, and if properly excavated, it brings us to so many essential questions in terms of our whole belief system. Clearly, once upon a time, it was accepted both among Jews and non-Jews that women and men are radically different in their intellectual capabilities, so that schooling was something to which women were only very slowly admitted to. And as you mentioned before, the vote was only achieved in the late 19th and early 20th centuries for women in European society. In the rest of the world, I think it was far later, if ever, achieved. So what happened was, I think, that there was no longer a necessity for women to be at home. You didn't have to make hamish halokshin, you didn't have to ground the gefilte fish, all the things that made for a long, hard day's work for women. So now we have a problem. We have these women, and girls in particular, who have a lot of time, a lot of time. And what started to happen was, since they had no education, Jewish or otherwise, they drifted towards the outside world. And this was the problem confronted in Eastern Europe, which led to the establishment of the Beis Yaakov movement, not without its opponents in Galicia and Interland in Hungary, not without its opponents. You established the Beis Yaakov movement. Now, this opens up a whole can of worms because the girls prove themselves to be capable students. They're capable of mastering subjects. They're capable of eventually, post World War II, going out and having successful careers as doctors and lawyers and business people. So now you've got a big problem. On what basis do we deny them, for example, the study of Talmud by saying, as we once did, Nashim Dat and Kalas and Tiflis and Tipshus and all that? On what basis do we deny them the study of Talmud? So the modern Orthodox world eventually, not quickly, not overnight, but eventually, I'd say somewhere in the early 80s, because when I first go into chinuch in modern Orthodox high school education, girls are still limited to mishnayos which discuss halacha. And I was told we can learn kol habasa and chulin and similar, but you can't learn anything beyond that. This is modern Orthodox high schools in the 1970s. So first in the 1980s and so forth, and Rav Soloveitchik teaches a shir in Stern in Gemara. So that begins to change. And now Gemara is part of their curriculum. But I think the basic problem here is the philosophical one. One, what will the modern Orthodox do with all these Malmare Chazal and all these halachas, which seem to distinguish very much between men and women? And alternatively, what is the Haredi world, for lack of a better term, going to do with the fact that girls seem to be very, very capable students? So the Haredi world, and more so in America than in Eretz Yisrael, but the Haredi world has created a demanding curriculum with many subjects of Limud Chol, Limud Kodesh for girls. Not Gemara, not Gemara. They can learn a long Ramban in Pashas Mishpatim with many citations from Bava Kama and Bava Metzia, but can't learn the Gemara itself inside. This is a very interesting worldview, and they're still casting about to get to articulate the rationale for that. They would probably have to say that there is something inherent in Gemara which is antithetical to the true nature of women. That's what they'd have to say. I don't think they can any longer maintain Dat and Kalas and Tiflis and Tipshus and all that. I don't think they can maintain that anymore. But as a fundamental reordering. Now, how does that reordering affect our understanding of Torah Shabbat Peh and Torah Shabbat Ksav? How does it a few years ago, there was a woman who became a judge, I think, in some court in Brooklyn, and one of the Amia Mishpacha, one of those magazines, put her on the front cover, celebrating this fact that a woman had become a judge. Does nobody think about the fact that in basic halacha, a woman is forbidden to be a judge? Or even a witness, forget about a judge, even a witness. So again, there is a lot of explanation and permutation that still has to take place in this area. It is far from clear where to go, and wherever you go, there are going to be some problems. So to sum up, feminism hit us like a ton of bricks. There were many different responses within Orthodoxy, but all segments of Orthodoxy have adjusted themselves. The most fanatical Hasidic movements have extensive girls' schools and extensive girls' education. From Satmar to Meir Sharim, they all have it. So it did alter our calm trajectory to a significant extent. Again, it's playing out in various forms, so I can't predict where it's going to go. I have a Talmud of mine who made one humorous comment here, which I think is very illustrative of the problem. He said, Hasidic girls' schools teach many, many subjects, Kodesh and Chol, in the hope that no girl becomes interested in any of them.
Okay. We've talked obviously about disputes, and we certainly live in a time where we need unity and achdut and not disputes. That's really the mandate of the time. So trying to bring it all back, a dispute for the sake of heaven, a machloket l'shem shamayim. What defines a dispute for the sake of heaven? And can we say that some of the disputes that we've spoken about, that you've addressed, are exactly that, for the sake of heaven?
I'd say that all of them fit in that category if one is within the framework of orthodoxy. And again, Menachem Kellner will get upset with me here, but if one is within the framework of orthodoxy, which I define as an allegiance to the 13 principles of faith and to the process of halach and shulchan aruch, if one is within that framework, then one is within the legitimate boundaries of orthodoxy, so that disagreements within that framework, rooted in that framework, I would say are all l'shem shamayim, by which I would say legitimate. They're all legitimate, and none of them can be seen as outside the parameters. L'shem shamayim, listen, for the sake of heaven, who can be so audacious as to say they are l'shem shamayim? But as the phrase is used colloquially, I would say all those machalikas are machalikas l'shem shamayim. I just want to extend this question a drop further, which again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but sincerity of intent, even among those who are outside of orthodoxy, has to also be discussed and understood. How we should view that. Can we view that as inherently evil or false in some way, just because it lies outside the parameters of our faith? So I think that also has to be dealt with to some extent, but I think outside the confines of this question.
So are disputes then, even if we're defining them as for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, even those disputes had negative consequences, and people were hurt, people were, whatever happened in those disputes. Are they simply an inevitable part of Jewish history? Are they a source of growth and positive development? Is it the same in our individual lives? When we just, nothing, life is just not one nice, smooth thing. We're always going to get into conflict. It's a matter of how we view that conflict, how we react to that conflict, how we grow from that conflict. Is that the way to look at it? Or no, it's not such a positive thing in the historical perspective.
I certainly agree with you that it is inevitable. I think that if we were more clearly rooted in an expansive picture of orthodoxy, that would be able to say Elu ve'elu, but that's not the period in history we're living in. On a personal note, I'm somewhat in the peace camp in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, today, obviously, a very complex issue, but I always make it a point when I buy wine for Shabbos to buy wine from West Bank settlement wineries, because I want to express sort of a sense of achdus, even with those with whom I have disagreements. So I think that if we were truly rooted in orthodoxy, we would be able to do that. We would be able to say, you are legitimate, I am legitimate, we're both legitimate. But I think we're very far from that at this point, and that all camps express themselves in absolutist terms. And in truth, it always was like that. Throughout Jewish history, there have been disputes history is history. We march through history. I think it is part of the human condition, as you said. Now, is it positive or is it just a painful part of human history? Here I say, as one who has attempted to find inspiration and insight from all different camps, I would say it's positive. I'd like to be able to open up the Sifrei Musar of Kelem and Novadik and Slobodka, and also open up Sifrei Hasidus, and also open up Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Chalap, and I'd like to be able to derive spiritual sustenance, insight, inspiration from all of them. So at least in my case, and I think, let's say, Reb Shraga Favel Mendelowitz, those who are sort of koilel many different things, it is positive. Now, have we benefited each other somewhat? I don't know. My guess is that Litvish chasanas back in Lita didn't look quite like Litvish chasanas do today. I remember in Broyas that Rav Broya once wrote an article that wild Hasidic dancing has no place in German Orthodox weddings. So, and I'm sure today that all Yakish chasanas have wild Hasidic dancing done by all present. So we have irrigated. Each of us has irrigated each other to some extent. So I think if I had to rule and decide, I would say something good has happened here, but has it been with the cost of so many isurim and charamim and arrogant insularity and so forth? Yeah, I'm afraid it has. So are we going to become Hegelians, latter-day Orthodox Hegelians, and say it's been for the larger good as we march through history? Or are we going to say it's been way too painful and negative? I can't draw a conclusion on that. For me personally, I find it positive, but I don't know about Klal Yisrael as a whole. And finally, are we moving towards some endpoint where all will be synthesized, all will be brought together? I'm afraid we're going to have to wait for Mashiach to pull off that trick. It's going to be quite a feat for him to come to Yerushalayim and have Merkaz Harav and Meir Sharim and Yeshiva Samir all congregate.
How do you imagine it, Rabbi Schiller? How do you actually imagine it? Okay, Mashiach comes. Mashiach is a person. Let's say it's not a process of 100 years, but let's say it's Mashiach. Mashiach ben done. How do you imagine it? You're sitting where you're sitting, and there's some kind of an announcement. There's a tumult. I don't know. The earth shaking. The news and the radio says something's happening in Jerusalem. How do you envision it? Play it out.
Very humbling for all of us. I think that it's going to come as quite a shock to all involved that their Mahalach was not the be-all and end-all. But that humbling effect is going to be in all camps. So in that sense, I think the new Achdus will be created by that mutual experience of being humbled. That's what I would foresee.
Okay. So in summary, when you look at the Jewish world today, optimistic, pessimistic, somewhere in between, where are you?
There's no doubt we are experiencing an explosion of Torah learning and Torah knowledge, which no previous generations ever experienced. So that's certainly a very positive thing. On the other hand, there's the great sadness that 80–90% of Klal Yisrael is still not part of Shmiras Torah mitzvahs. So I think that's a great sadness, which we have not yet discovered a method to overcome. There have been Baal Tshuva movements and things, but we haven't discovered a foolproof method to overcome that. What I do see in Eretz Yisrael is that given the demographic future, which is going to be, despite all the Haredi and Orthodox fetching, is going to be an Orthodox future. It cannot be stopped. The amount of children had by Chadalim and Haredim and Sfardim and Kedoma, it's going to completely eclipse the non-Orthodox segments of the population, from a point where, let's say, in the first Israeli election, there was probably 50, 60 votes between seats in the Knesset between Mapai and Mapam, and today Meretz can't find one. So I think that that evolution is definitely taking place. Now, how is that going to play out? When Eretz Yisrael is a from Orthodox land, how is it going to play out? So I would hope that there will be some degree of that unifying humility in the future. Pessimistic, optimistic, I don't know. I live in the Haredi world. I'm very sad is not the word. I'm agonized due to their easy hatred and disdain towards non-Jews. Um, in the far right religious Zionist circles, I think you have that as well. So this is something very saddening for me. On the other hand, Shmiras HaMitzvahs, Chesed, to some degree, Midas, some degree, are on the improvement. So I don't think I can say positive or negative in the future. I think, as we said before, God is the king of history. We'll have to see.
Okay, we'll leave that on that note. We urge all our viewers and listeners to go online and read Rabbi Meir Schiller's works, thought-provoking and fascinating. And again, Rabbi Schiller, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you to you. Thank you.